From the outside, the Henderson family looked like something straight out of a magazine. The successful father, the elegant mother, the accomplished children living in their pristine suburban home with manicured lawns and family portraits lining the hallways. Neighbors envied their apparent perfection. Teachers praised their well-behaved children, and community members held them up as an example of what a family should be. But for 17-year-old David Henderson, living inside this perfect family was a nightmare of impossible expectations, emotional manipulation, and carefully hidden abuse. Behind their white picket fence and designer curtains, David's mother, Ruth, was a master manipulator who demanded nothing short of perfection from her children, while his father, Charles, was an emotionally distant workaholic who enabled her toxic behavior through willful blindness. David's younger sister, Jessica, was a golden child who could do no wrong, while David became the family's scapegoat, blamed for every problem, criticized for every imperfection, and emotionally tortured for failing to meet standards that were deliberately set beyond his reach. For years, David suffered in silence, knowing that no one would believe the truth about his picture-perfect family. But when his mother's abuse escalated to the point where David contemplated ending his own life, he made a desperate decision that would shatter the family's carefully constructed facade forever. This is the story of a boy who lived behind a mask of perfection, who endured years of psychological torture from the people who claimed to love him, and who finally found the courage to reveal the ugly truth that his family had spent so much energy hiding. When David finally spoke out, the perfect family image crumbled, but the question remained: was telling the truth worth losing everything he had ever known? Subscribe and tell me in the comments what you think about families who look perfect on the outside but hide terrible secrets. Have you ever lived behind a facade that everyone admired but no one truly understood? The first time I remember truly understanding that our family was different from other families, I was 9 years old, sitting in the pristine living room of our colonial-style house on Elm Avenue in Westfield, Connecticut, listening to my mother explain to Mrs. Patterson from next door why I wouldn't be attending her son Tommy's birthday party that weekend. David has been struggling with his behavior lately. My mother, Ruth Henderson, said in that perfectly modulated tone she used when discussing family matters with outsiders, "We feel it's important to help him understand that actions have consequences. A weekend of reflection will be much more beneficial than a birthday party." Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically, casting a concerned glance in my direction where I sat motionless on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, hands folded in my lap, exactly the way Mother had taught me. "Of course, Ruth, you always know what's best for your children. David is such a well-behaved boy. I'm sure he'll learn from whatever mistake he made." What Mrs. Patterson didn't know, what no one in our affluent suburban community knew, was that my behavioral struggle consisted of forgetting to return my library book exactly 3 days before it was due. What she couldn't see was the way my mother's perfectly manicured fingers had gripped my shoulder with bruising force when she discovered the overdue book in my backpack, or hear the 20-minute lecture about responsibility, respect, and the Henderson family reputation that had followed. The Henderson name means something in this community. My mother had hissed, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of the peppermint tea she drank constantly. When you are careless and irresponsible, you don't just embarrass yourself. You embarrass all of us. Do you understand what that means, David? I understood. I understood that in our family, every action was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every imperfection treated as a moral failing that reflected on the carefully constructed image my mother had spent years building. I understood that being a Henderson child meant living under a microscope, where even the smallest deviation from perfection could result in punishments that were always framed as learning experiences and character building. From the outside, the Henderson family was everything our upper-middle-class neighborhood aspired to be. My father, Charles Henderson, was a successful investment banker who wore expensive suits and drove a black BMW to his downtown office every morning. My mother was a perfect suburban housewife, always impeccably dressed, always volunteering for the right charities, always hosting the most elegant dinner parties. Our house was a showcase of good taste and financial success, with professionally landscaped gardens, antique furniture, and walls lined with family photographs that captured what appeared to be moments of genuine happiness and love. My younger sister Jessica, 2 years my junior, seemed to fit effortlessly into this perfect picture. She was beautiful, charming, academically gifted, and blessed with the kind of natural grace that made adults smile and coo over her accomplishments. Jessica brought home straight A's without effort, excelled at piano and dance lessons, and had never, as far as I could remember, done anything that disappointed our parents. But I was different. From my earliest memories, I was a child who struggled to meet the Henderson family standards. I was naturally introverted in a family that valued social charm. I was artistic and dreamy in a family that prized practical achievement. I was sensitive in a family that saw emotional expression as weakness. And most damaging of all, I was honest in a family that had built its entire identity around maintaining appearances. The Henderson family operated according to a complex set of unwritten rules that governed every aspect of our lives. We were never to show negative emotions in public. We were never to discuss family business with outsiders. We were never to do anything that might reflect poorly on the family's reputation. We were to be polite, accomplished, well-dressed, and perpetually grateful for the privileges we enjoyed as members of such a successful family. For Jessica, following these rules seemed as natural as breathing. She instinctively understood how to charm adults, how to present herself as the perfect daughter, how to navigate social situations with a kind of effortless grace that made everyone around her feel good about themselves. She was my mother's pride and joy, living proof that the Henderson approach to child rearing produced exceptional results. But I struggled with every aspect of performance that came so easily to my sister. I was awkward in social situations, preferring books to parties, art projects to sports, quiet conversations to the kind of animated socializing that impressed adults. I had opinions about things that didn't always align with my parents' views, and I had an unfortunate tendency to express those opinions honestly when asked. My mother saw my differences not as personality traits to be accepted and nurtured, but as flaws to be corrected through increasingly harsh discipline and psychological manipulation. She had a gift for identifying my vulnerabilities and exploiting them in ways that would teach me to conform to her expectations. When I was 10, I made the mistake of mentioning at a dinner party that I didn't think our cat, Princess, was very happy because she never went outside. My mother smiled graciously at the guests and redirected the conversation. But later that evening, she sat me down for one of her teaching moments. "David," she said, her voice calm but her eyes cold, "when you criticize the way we care for our pets in front of guests, what message do you think that sends about our family?" I wasn't criticizing. I protested weakly. I just thought maybe Princess would like. "You were questioning my decisions in front of people who respect and admire our family," she interrupted. "You were making me look like a careless pet owner. Do you think that's appropriate behavior for a Henderson child?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with my mother systematically dismantling my perspective, explaining how my comment had been disrespectful, inappropriate, and embarrassing to the entire family. By the end, I was crying and apologizing, promising to think more carefully before speaking in the future. But the lesson didn't end there. For the next week, I was responsible for all of Princess's care. Feeding, cleaning her litter box, brushing her fur, and documenting every aspect of her behavior in a notebook that my mother reviewed each evening. If Princess seemed unhappy for even a moment, it was my fault for not caring for her properly. If she was content and playful, it was proof that my original observation had been wrong and unfair. This was my mother's genius. She could turn any criticism, any sign of independent thinking, any deviation from a family script into a learning experience that would ultimately reinforce her authority and my dependence on her approval. She never raised her voice, never used physical violence, never did anything that would leave visible marks or obvious evidence of abuse. Instead, she used psychological manipulation, emotional withholding, and elaborate punishment systems that taught me to police my own thoughts and behaviors. School became my refuge, the only place where I could sometimes forget about the constant pressure to perform perfectly for my family. I was a good student, though not the straight-A achiever that Jessica was, and I found solace in creative subjects like art and creative writing where I could express feelings and ideas that had no place in the Henderson household. My art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was the first adult who seemed to see something valuable in my sensitivity and creativity. She encouraged me to enter a district-wide art competition, and when I won second place for a painting that depicted a bird trapped in a beautiful but confining cage, I was thrilled to have achieved something that was entirely my own. But when I brought the award certificate home, my mother's reaction was not what I had hoped for. She studied the certificate carefully, then looked at the painting I had been so proud of. "It's very dark, David," she said finally. "Why would you choose to paint something so depressing? When people see this painting, what do you think they'll assume about our family?" I tried to explain that it wasn't supposed to be about our family, that it was just an artistic expression, that Mrs. Rodriguez had said it showed real talent and emotional depth. But my mother wasn't interested in Mrs. Rodriguez's opinion or my artistic intentions. Art should elevate and inspire, she explained patiently. It should reflect the beauty and joy in the world. When you create something dark and troubling, you're not just expressing yourself. You're sharing your inner state with others. And if your inner state is dark and depressing, then we need to address what's causing that, don't we? The conversation evolved into another of her elaborate teaching moments. This one focused on the importance of maintaining a positive attitude and finding healthy ways to express creativity. The painting disappeared from my room, and I was enrolled in private art lessons with an instructor my mother selected, someone who specialized in landscapes and still lives rather than the more abstract, emotional work I had been drawn to. This pattern repeated itself throughout my childhood and early adolescence. Any sign that I might be developing interests, opinions, or talents that didn't align with the Henderson family image was met with sophisticated forms of correction designed to bring me back into line. My mother never seemed cruel or unreasonable to outsiders. She was always acting in my best interest, helping me develop character, guiding me toward better choices. Meanwhile, Jessica continued to flourish in ways that brought nothing but pride to our parents. She was elected class president, excelled in competitive dance, won academic awards, and charmed every adult she encountered. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the lifestyle that felt so constraining to me, thriving on the social expectations and performance demands that made me feel like I was slowly suffocating. The contrast between Jessica's effortless success and my constant struggle to meet family expectations became a source of ongoing tension and comparison. My mother never explicitly said that Jessica was a good child and I was a problem child, but the message was communicated in countless subtle ways. When Jessica brought home an award, the entire family celebrated with a special dinner and phone calls to relatives. When I achieved something noteworthy, it was acknowledged briefly and then followed by suggestions for how I could do even better next time. Jessica's room was redecorated whenever she expressed interest in a new color scheme or style. My room remained unchanged for years because, as my mother explained, David doesn't seem to know what he wants. So there's no point in making changes until he develops a clearer sense of his preferences. Jessica's friends were always welcome in our home, treated as honored guests who brought energy and joy to our family gatherings. My friends were tolerated politely, but subjected to subtle scrutiny that made them uncomfortable and less likely to visit again. Jessica was encouraged to participate in activities that interested her, even when they were expensive or inconvenient. My interests were evaluated carefully for their potential impact on the family's reputation and budget, often deemed impractical or inappropriate for various reasons. The psychological impact of living as a designated problem child in a family obsessed with perfection was devastating in ways I couldn't fully understand at the time. I developed chronic anxiety, constantly worried that my next mistake would bring another round of correction and consequences. I became hypervigilant about my behavior, analyzing every word and action for potential family image violations. I learned to suppress my natural personality traits, my sensitivity, creativity, and honesty, in favor of a carefully constructed persona that might finally earn the approval I craved. But no matter how hard I tried to conform to my family's expectations, I never seemed to get it quite right. If I was quiet and well-behaved, I was criticized for being sullen and antisocial. If I tried to be more outgoing and engaging, I was told I was trying too hard and being inauthentic. If I focused on academics to match Jessica's achievements, I was accused of being overly competitive and putting too much pressure on myself. If I relaxed my academic efforts, I was lazy and unmotivated. It was an impossible situation that left me feeling constantly off balance and inadequate. I began to internalize the message that there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some basic flaw in my character that prevented me from being the kind of son my parents wanted and deserved. My father's role in this dynamic was complicated by his own relationship with my mother and his general approach to family life. Charles Henderson was not an actively abusive parent, but his emotional absence and willful blindness to my mother's psychological manipulation made him an enabler rather than a protector. Dad worked long hours and traveled frequently for business, leaving most of the child-rearing responsibilities to my mother. When he was home, he seemed perpetually exhausted and stressed, more interested in unwinding from his professional obligations than engaging deeply with family drama. He loved us, I think, but in a distant, abstract way that didn't translate into emotional availability or advocacy when we needed it. When conflict arose between my mother and me, my father's default response was to support whatever decision she had made. "Your mother knows what's best for you children," was a standard response to any complaint or concern I might raise. He seemed to view family harmony as my mother's responsibility and family discipline as her area of expertise, leaving him free to focus on his career and financial obligations. This meant that my mother operated with almost unlimited authority over my daily life, with no meaningful checks or balances from my father. She could implement whatever punishment systems, behavioral modification programs, or psychological interventions she deemed necessary, secure in the knowledge that my father would support her decisions without question. The isolation was profound. I couldn't confide in my father because he would simply defer to my mother's judgment. I couldn't talk to Jessica because she genuinely didn't understand why I found our family life so difficult. For her, the Henderson way of life was natural and rewarding. I couldn't discuss family problems with friends or teachers because that would violate the fundamental rule about not airing family business in public. So I learned to suffer in silence, developing elaborate internal coping mechanisms to deal with the constant stress of living under such intense scrutiny and control. I kept journals that I had carefully, wrote stories and poems I never shared with anyone, and created detailed fantasy worlds in my mind where I could be accepted and valued for who I actually was rather than who I was supposed to become. High school brought new challenges as my mother's expectations evolved to match my approaching adulthood. It was no longer enough to be well-behaved and academically successful. I was now expected to excel in ways that would reflect positively on the family's social status and intellectual sophistication. I was pressured to join the debate team because it was intellectually prestigious. Despite my natural introversion and discomfort with confrontational discourse, I was required to take leadership roles in student government and community service organizations, regardless of my own interests or aptitudes. My mother researched the most competitive colleges and began planning my academic schedule and extracurricular activities around admission requirements for schools that I had never expressed interest in attending. Every aspect of my high school experience was filtered through the lens of how it would look on college applications, how it would reflect on the Henderson family's commitment to excellence, and how it would position me for the kind of successful adult life that would make my parents proud. My own preferences, interests, and natural talents were irrelevant unless they aligned with these larger strategic goals. The pressure intensified during my junior year, when college planning became a primary focus of family life. My mother researched admission statistics, interviewed other parents about successful application strategies, and hired a private college counselor to help optimize my chances of acceptance to prestigious universities. But despite all this professional guidance and parental investment, my academic performance and extracurricular achievements were consistently solid rather than spectacular. I was a good student but not a brilliant one, a competent participant in various activities but not a standout leader or performer. I was exactly the kind of well-rounded, accomplished teenager that most families would be proud of, but in the Henderson household, good enough was never actually good enough. My mother's disappointment in my failure to achieve the kind of extraordinary success that would distinguish our family was expressed through increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological pressure. She never directly criticized my efforts, but she had mastered the art of communicating disapproval through subtle expressions of concern, disappointment, and comparison. "I worry that you're not living up to your potential," became a constant refrain during our regular check-in conversations about my progress. "I see so much capability in you, David, but I'm not sure you're pushing yourself hard enough to really excel." These conversations always included detailed analysis of my failures and shortcomings, presented as loving concern rather than criticism. My mother would point out ways that Jessica managed her responsibilities more efficiently, how my classmates seemed more focused and driven, how my teachers had mentioned that I seemed distracted or unmotivated in class. "I know you're capable of more," she would conclude, her voice filled with a kind of disappointed love that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "I just need to understand what's holding you back so we can address it together." But there was nothing holding me back except the crushing weight of her expectations and the psychological exhaustion that came from living under constant evaluation and judgment. I wasn't unmotivated or distracted. I was depressed, anxious, and overwhelmed by the impossible task of trying to be perfect enough to earn unconditional acceptance from parents who seemed incapable of providing it. My senior year became a nightmare of college applications, scholarship essays, and interview preparation that consumed every aspect of my life. My mother transformed our dining room into a command center for my college admissions campaign, complete with spreadsheets tracking application deadlines, essay drafts, and status updates from guidance counselors. Every conversation in our house revolved around college planning. My mother would discuss my applications with neighbors, teachers, and family friends, always presented herself as a devoted mother working tirelessly to help her son achieve his dreams. But the dreams she described were entirely her own. I had never expressed interest in attending an Ivy League university or pursuing the kind of high-pressure career path she was planning for me. When I tried to express some preferences about colleges that appealed to me, smaller schools with strong creative writing programs, state universities with more relaxed social atmospheres, my mother would listen patiently and then explain why those choices wouldn't serve my long-term interests. "You're thinking like a 17-year-old, she would say with an indulgent smile. "I'm thinking like someone who wants you to have every possible opportunity for success and happiness. Trust me, David. In 10 years, you'll thank me for pushing you toward excellence rather than settling for comfort." The college application process became another venue for my mother to demonstrate her sophisticated understanding of my character flaws and learning needs. She edited my essays extensively, transforming my authentic voice into something more polished and strategic. She scheduled practice interviews with family friends who worked in admissions or related fields. She even hired a consultant to help me develop a more confident and engaging speaking style for interviews. All of this intensive preparation and investment created enormous pressure to justify my mother's efforts through acceptance to appropriately prestigious institutions. When my rejection letters started arriving in the spring, each one felt like a personal failure that reflected not just on my own capabilities, but on my mother's investment in my success. My mother's response to my college rejections was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as supportive parenting. She never expressed anger or disappointment directly. Instead, she worried aloud about what these rejections might mean about my preparation and effort level. "I just can't understand it," she would say to my father while I was within earshot. "David is such a bright boy, and we invested so much in helping him present himself well. I wonder if he really understood how important these applications were, or if he just wasn't ready for that level of competition." These conversations were designed to make me feel guilty for failing to appreciate the sacrifices my parents had made on my behalf, while simultaneously planting doubts about my own effort and commitment. My mother never directly accused me of sabotaging my applications, but she created an atmosphere where that conclusion felt inevitable. The few acceptances I did receive were to good, but not spectacular schools, exactly the kind of solid, respectable institutions that most families would celebrate enthusiastically. But in the Henderson household, these acceptances were treated as consolation prizes that we would make the best of despite their obvious limitations. State University has some wonderful programs. My mother would tell people when they asked about my college plans, her tone conveying the subtle message that we were settling for something less than what we had hoped for, but maintaining a positive attitude about it. This pattern of damning with faint praise, of accepting my achievements while simultaneously communicating disappointment in their inadequacy, had become so central to my relationship with my mother that I barely noticed it anymore. I had internalized her standards so completely that I felt genuinely ashamed of my college acceptances, even though they represented significant accomplishments that I should have been proud of. The summer before college became a countdown to my escape from the Henderson household, but also a period of intense anxiety about whether I was capable of succeeding independently. My mother had spent so many years managing, directing, and correcting my choices that I had little confidence in my ability to make good decisions without her guidance. She seemed to sense my growing independence and intensified her efforts to maintain control over my life even as I prepared to leave home. She researched my freshman dorm assignment and contacted my future roommates' parents to coordinate move-in plans. She scheduled meetings with academic advisors at my university to discuss course selection and career planning. She even arranged for me to meet with therapists before leaving for college. not because I had requested mental health support, but because she wanted to ensure I was emotionally prepared for the challenges of independent living. The therapist, Dr. Ellen Morrison, was the first adult who seemed to recognize that there might be something problematic about my family dynamics. During our intake session, she asked detailed questions about my relationship with my parents, my anxiety symptoms, and my concerns about college. When I described my mother's intensive involvement in my college planning and her concerns about my emotional preparation for independence, Dr. Morrison looked puzzled rather than impressed by my mother's devotion. "It sounds like your mother has very strong opinions about your life choices," she observed carefully. "How do you feel about the level of guidance she provides?" The question caught me off guard because no adult had ever suggested that my mother's involvement in my life might be excessive or problematic. I had spent so many years accepting her control as evidence of love and investment that I had never considered whether it might be unhealthy. "I don't know," I admitted. She knows more about these things than I do. She's just trying to help me succeed." Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, but didn't push the topic further during our first session. Over the following weeks, however, she gently encouraged me to think about my own preferences and goals independent of my family's expectations. "What kind of college experience are you hoping for?" she asked during one session. "Not what your mother thinks would be good for you, but what you personally want your next 4 years to look like." It was a simple question, but I realized I had no idea how to answer it. I had spent so many years trying to meet other people's expectations that I had never developed clear preferences of my own. I knew what would make my mother proud, what would impress my father, what would maintain the Henderson family reputation. But I had no sense of what would make me happy or fulfilled. Dr. Morrison helped me understand that this confusion wasn't a character flaw, but a natural result of growing up in a family system where independent thinking was discouraged and conformity was rewarded. She introduced me to concepts like boundaries, emotional manipulation, and psychological control that gave me vocabulary for understanding dynamics I had always accepted as normal. Healthy families encourage independence and individual identity development, she explained during one session that felt particularly revelatory. When parents use guilt, shame, or emotional withdrawal to control their children's choices, they're prioritizing their own needs over their child's healthy development. For the first time in my life, I began to consider the possibility that my mother's intensive management of my life might not be evidence of love, but of dysfunction. The thought was terrifying because it suggested that everything I had believed about my family and myself might be fundamentally wrong. But it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. If my inability to please my mother wasn't evidence of my own inadequacy, then maybe I wasn't the fundamentally flawed person I had always believed myself to be. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was too sensitive, too unmotivated, or too selfish to appreciate my family's investment in my success. As my departure for college approached, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about my future. For the first time, I would be living somewhere my mother couldn't monitor my daily choices, somewhere I could explore interests and relationships without worrying about how they reflected on the Henderson family reputation. But I also felt guilty about my excitement, worried that my desire for independence was evidence of the selfishness and ingratitude my mother had always warned me about. The psychological conditioning of 17 years doesn't disappear overnight, and I struggled with conflicting feelings of anticipation and shame as my departure date approached. 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for college, everything came to a head in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was in my room, packing the last of my belongings, and trying to decide which personal items were worth taking to my dorm room, when I discovered that my private journal was missing from its hiding place behind my bookshelf. I searched frantically for several minutes before the terrible realization dawned on me. My mother had found and read the journal where I had recorded my thoughts about our family, my conversations with Dr. Morrison, and my growing understanding of the dysfunction in our household. The journal contained 2 years' worth of honest observations about my mother's psychological manipulation, my father's emotional absence, and the devastating impact their parenting style had had on my mental health and self-esteem. It included detailed accounts of specific incidents that I had always kept secret, analyses of family dynamics that I had never shared with anyone, and expressions of anger and hurt that I had never been allowed to voice aloud. I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her, her face calm, but her eyes blazing with the kind of controlled fury I had learned to fear more than explosive anger. "I think we need to have a conversation, David," she said quietly, her voice carrying a particular tone that meant I was in more trouble than I had ever been before. The next 3 hours were unlike anything I had ever experienced. My mother systematically went through each entry in my journal, demanding explanations for every criticism, every expression of anger, every observation about our family that deviated from the official Henderson narrative. She was particularly outraged by my descriptions of her parenting methods as manipulative and controlling. "Is this what Dr. Morrison has been teaching you?" she demanded, pointing to a passage where I had written about emotional manipulation and psychological control. "Is this the kind of poison she's been filling your head with about your family?" I tried to defend myself, to explain that the journal was private and that my thoughts didn't necessarily reflect my true feelings about our family. But my mother was relentless in her interrogation, treating every critical observation as evidence of my fundamental ingratitude and disloyalty. "After everything your father and I have sacrificed for you," she said, her voice rising for the first time, "this is how you really see us? As abusive parents who have damaged you? As manipulative monsters who have ruined your life?" The accusation was devastating because it contained just enough truth to make me feel guilty for my honesty. Yes, I had written critically about my parents' behavior. Yes, I had expressed anger and resentment about the ways their expectations had affected my mental health. Yes, I had begun to see some of their parenting methods as problematic rather than loving. But I had also written about my love for them, my gratitude for their financial support, my recognition that they believed they were acting in my best interests. My mother, however, focused exclusively on the critical passages, while ignoring any expressions of love or appreciation. "I think it's clear that you're not ready for the independence of college," she concluded after reading through the entire journal. "You're obviously confused about our family relationships, influenced by a therapist who doesn't understand our values, and filled with anger that you haven't learned to process in healthy ways." The punishment she devised was swift and comprehensive. She called the university and withdrew my enrollment, citing concerns about my emotional readiness for college. She canceled my appointments with Dr. Morrison, explaining that therapy had clearly been counterproductive for someone my age. She informed my father that I would be staying home for at least a year, working and demonstrating my commitment to family values before we reconsidered college plans. "This isn't punishment," she explained to my father while I sat there in stunned silence. "This is intervention. David needs time to mature and gain perspective on his relationships with the people who love him most. A year at home will help him understand what's truly important." My father, true to form, supported my mother's decision without question. "Your mother knows what's best," he said when I tried to appeal to him privately. "Maybe some time at home will help you appreciate what you have here." The next morning, I was supposed to be driving to college to begin my independent adult life. Instead, I was sitting in the same bedroom I had occupied for 17 years, surrounded by packed boxes that would now need to be unpacked, facing the prospect of another year under my mother's intensive supervision and control. The despair was overwhelming. I had been so close to escape, so close to the opportunity to discover who I might become without constant monitoring and correction. The realization that my mother could simply cancel my future with a few phone calls made me understand how powerless I really was, how completely my life was still subject to her authority. But it also crystallized something important about our family dynamic. My mother's response to my private thoughts and feelings revealed the true nature of our relationship in ways that years of subtle manipulation had obscured. She wasn't interested in understanding my perspective or addressing concerns I had raised about our family. She was only interested in controlling my thoughts and maintaining her authority over my life. That night, lying in my childhood bed instead of my college dorm room, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to tell the truth about my family, publicly and completely, regardless of the consequences. If my mother could use my private thoughts to justify controlling my future, then I would make those thoughts public in ways she couldn't control or cancel. I started by calling Dr. Morrison and explaining what had happened. Despite my mother's attempt to cancel our therapeutic relationship, Dr. Morrison was willing to meet with me as an adult seeking mental health support. She helped me understand that what happened with my journal was a serious violation of privacy and a form of psychological abuse designed to maintain control over my emerging independence. More importantly, she helped me develop a plan for safely extricating myself from my family's control. As an 18-year-old adult, I had legal rights that my mother couldn't simply override, including the right to make my own educational and living decisions. The fact that she had withdrawn my college enrollment without my consent was legally problematic, and there were steps I could take to reverse her decisions. But Dr. Morrison also warned me that confronting my family directly would likely result in escalated manipulation and control tactics. People who use psychological control don't typically respond well to being challenged, she explained. Your mother may become more extreme in her efforts to maintain authority over your life. She was right. Over the following weeks, my mother implemented increasingly strict controls over my daily life, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with basic decisions. She monitored my phone calls, restricted my access to the car, and required detailed explanations for any time I spent away from home. She also began a campaign to discredit Dr. Morrison, claiming that our therapist was interfering with family relationships and encouraging unhealthy rebellion against parental authority. But the most devastating part of this period was watching how our community responded to my mother's version of events. She had crafted a narrative about my emotional breakdown and identity crisis that positioned her as a devoted mother dealing with a troubled teenager who had been negatively influenced by outside forces. Our neighbors, teachers, and family friends rallied around my mother with sympathy and support. They praised her for recognizing that I wasn't ready for college independence and for having the courage to delay my enrollment despite the social embarrassment. They offered advice about dealing with difficult teenagers and shared stories about other young people who had needed extra time to mature before beginning their adult lives. No one questioned my mother's version of events. No one asked for my perspective on what had happened. No one seemed to find it strange that an 18-year-old with good grades and no history of behavioral problems would suddenly become too emotionally unstable for college. The Henderson family reputation for wisdom and sophistication was so well established that everyone simply assumed my mother's assessment of the situation was accurate. This community response was more isolating than anything my family had done directly. I realized that the perfect family image my mother had spent years constructing wasn't just about social status. It was also insurance against anyone questioning her parenting methods or believing any criticism that might come from her children. Who would believe that the elegant, articulate, devoted Ruth Henderson was psychologically abusive when she was so obviously invested in her children's success? Who would question the judgment of someone who had raised such accomplished, well-behaved children and maintained such a beautiful, harmonious household? The answer was no one. At least, no one in our community was prepared to consider that the Henderson family's perfect exterior might conceal serious dysfunction and abuse. That's when I realized that the only way anyone would ever believe the truth about my family was if I told that truth in ways that couldn't be dismissed, denied, or reframed. I needed to document the reality of our family life so clearly and comprehensively that even people who wanted to maintain their illusions about the Henderson family would be forced to confront the evidence. I began secretly recording conversations with my mother, documenting the psychological manipulation and control tactics she used to maintain authority over my life. I took photographs of the elaborate punishment systems and behavioral monitoring charts she had created to track my compliance with family rules. I wrote detailed accounts of specific incidents that illustrated the gap between our family's public image and private reality. Most importantly, I contacted my college admissions office and explained that my enrollment had been canceled without my knowledge or consent. With Dr. Morrison's help, I was able to provide documentation of my legal status as an adult and my desire to pursue my education despite my family's objections. The university was surprisingly supportive and worked with me to restore my enrollment for the spring semester. But I knew that simply leaving home wouldn't be enough to address the larger problem of my family's deception and abuse. Too many people in our community have been taken in by my mother's performance, and too many other children might be suffering in similar situations without anyone recognizing the warning signs. So I made a decision that I knew would destroy my relationship with my family forever. I was going to expose the truth about the Henderson family publicly, completely, and irrefutably. The opportunity came during a community meeting about mental health resources for teenagers. My mother was serving on the planning committee, positioning herself as an expert on adolescent development and family crisis intervention. She was scheduled to speak about the importance of parental involvement in addressing teenage behavioral problems and emotional instability. I attended that meeting with a prepared statement about my own experience as a Henderson child, complete with audio recordings, photographs, and documentation that revealed the reality behind our family's perfect facade. When the time came for community questions and discussion, I stood up and asked if I could share some thoughts about family dynamics and mental health from a teenager's perspective. My mother's face went white when she realized what was about to happen. She tried to interrupt me, to redirect the conversation, to maintain control over the narrative. But I had prepared too carefully and documented too thoroughly for her to simply dismiss my testimony. For 20 minutes, I calmly and systematically revealed the truth about growing up in the Henderson household. I played recordings of my mother's psychological manipulation tactics. I showed photographs of the punishment and monitoring systems she had used to control my behavior. I read excerpts from the journals she had violated, explaining how her methods had affected my mental health and development. The room was silent as I spoke, the audience clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence I was presenting with their long-held beliefs about our family. My mother sat frozen at the front of the room, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of public exposure. When I finished speaking, the silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, people began to ask questions. Not hostile challenges to my credibility, but genuine inquiries about how such dysfunction could exist behind such a perfect exterior. Other parents shared their own concerns about community families that seemed too good to be true. Teenagers who had been afraid to speak up about their own family problems began to find their voices. My mother never spoke again that evening. She gathered her materials and left the meeting early, my father following silently behind her. Within hours, the story had spread throughout our community, destroying the carefully constructed image that had defined our family's identity for decades. The aftermath was brutal. My parents disowned me completely, telling friends and family that I was a disturbed young man who had created elaborate lies to justify my own failures and rebellion. Some people in our community believed their version and continued to view me as an ungrateful child who had betrayed loving parents. But many others began to see the Henderson family dynamics with new clarity, recognizing warning signs they had previously missed or dismissed. More importantly, my decision to speak publicly about psychological abuse and family dysfunction opened conversations that had been suppressed in our achievement-oriented community. Other young people began to share their own stories about families that prioritized image over authentic relationship, parents who use emotional manipulation to maintain control, and the devastating impact of growing up in households where love was conditional on performance. I left for college 3 months later, carrying nothing from my childhood home except the clothes I could pack in 2 suitcases. I had no relationship with my parents, no financial support, and no safety net beyond what I could create for myself. But I also had something I had never possessed before: the freedom to discover who I really was without constantly worrying about whether that person would meet someone else's expectations. The first year of college was difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. I struggled with depression, anxiety, and the lingering effects of 17 years of psychological conditioning. I had to learn basic life skills that most of my peers had developed gradually with their family support. I worked multiple jobs to pay for expenses that other students' parents covered automatically. But it was also the most authentic year of my life up to that point. For the first time, I could explore interests, develop relationships, and make mistakes without worrying about how they would reflect on the Henderson family reputation. I could be honest about my thoughts and feelings without fearing punishment or correction. I could simply exist as myself rather than as a carefully constructed performance designed to meet someone else's standards. Now, 5 years later, I'm finishing my master's degree in social work, specializing in family therapy and adolescent mental health. I work with teenagers who are struggling with family dysfunction, and I use my own experience to help them understand that they're not responsible for their parents' emotional problems or family reputation. I have no relationship with my parents or Jessica, who chose to maintain loyalty to the family image rather than acknowledge the reality of our childhood. Sometimes I feel sad about the family connections I've lost, but I've never regretted my decision to tell the truth about our supposedly perfect household. The most rewarding part of my current work is helping other young people recognize that families can be loving without being controlling, supported without being manipulative, and invested in their children's success without sacrificing their children's authentic development. Perfect families don't exist, but healthy families do. And sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is admit that what looks perfect from the outside might be poisonous from the inside, and choose authenticity over appearance regardless of the cost. That's the lesson I learned from growing up as a Henderson. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to tell the truth, even when that truth destroys a beautiful lie that everyone wants to believe.